The house felt full that afternoon, not just with people, but with noise, smells, and small emotions moving through the rooms. It was one of those family gatherings that didn't have a big reason behind it. No birthday, no holiday, just a day when everyone decided to come together because it had been a while. Food was cooking in the kitchen, chairs were pulled closer, laughter came and went in waves. The main character of this story watched it all from a quiet spot near the window. He wasn't hosting, and he wasn't the center of attention. He had learned long ago how to blend into the background when needed. He held a cup of tea in both hands, not really drinking it, just letting the warmth steady him. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes took in everything. Most people there didn't know much about him. To them, he was just a relative by marriage, someone who showed up rarely and spoke even less. He dressed simply, nothing fancy, nothing that stood out. His hair was neatly trimmed, his face calm, though lines around his eyes hinted at a life that had not always been easy. Across the room, the brother-in-law was already making his presence known. He was loud, confident, and enjoyed being heard more than listening. He spoke over others, laughed at his own jokes, and moved from group to group like he owned the space. People had learned to tolerate him over the years. Some rolled their eyes quietly. Others forced smiles. The brother-in-law loved attention. He liked being the one with the strongest opinion, the sharpest comment. That day was no different. He talked about his job, his plans, his views on everything from politics to sports. No one had asked, but he spoke anyway. The quiet man by the window stayed silent. He nodded politely when spoken to and stepped aside when people passed. A few family members greeted him warmly, asking how he had been. He answered with short, kind replies. All good. Keeping busy. Can't complain. Then he returned to listening. The smell of food grew stronger as time passed. Plates were laid out on the table and people slowly gathered closer. Someone turned the television volume down. The noise softened, but the brother-in-law's voice still cut through it at some point. The conversation shifted naturally, as it often does to life stories. Someone mentioned a cousin who had moved abroad. Another talked about a neighbor who had joined the military years ago. It was casual. It's nothing serious. That was when the brother-in-law laughed and shook his head. I don't get all this hero talk, he said loudly. People act like wearing a uniform makes someone special. Few people exchanged looks. One person tried to change the subject, but he wasn't done. Come on, he continued. Most of them just follow orders. What's so heroic about that? The room grew quieter. Not silent, but careful. Some people looked down at their plates. Others pretended to be busy with their phones. Nobody wanted an argument. The quiet man near the window finally lifted his eyes. He didn't look angry. If anything, he looked thoughtful. After a pause, he spoke, his voice calm and steady. Some people don't choose that life for praise, he said. They choose it because someone has to stand in the way when things go wrong. It wasn't a long sentence. It wasn't dramatic. But it carried weight. The brother-in-law turned toward him, surprised that someone had spoken back. For a second, he just stared. Then he laughed. That's one way to put it, he said. Sounds nice? But real life isn't a movie. The quiet man didn't respond right away. He took a slow sip of tea, then lowered the cup. Real life is exactly why it matters, he said simply. Again, silence. The words landed softly but firmly. A few people nodded without realizing it. The brother-in-law's smile faded, replaced by something sharper. You speak like you know, he said. Were you in the military or something? The question hung in the air. The quiet man didn't rush to answer. He looked around the room at the faces he recognized and the ones he barely knew. He seemed to weigh his response. I served, he said finally. Just 2 words. The brother-in-law let out a short laugh. Served, he repeated. Everyone says that. Doesn't mean much. Few people shifted uncomfortably. One older relative cleared their throat, trying again to move the conversation toward the food. But the moment had already changed. The quiet man didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply nodded, as if accepting the comment without agreement. The brother-in-law mistook that calm for weakness. I just think people exaggerate, he went on. All this talk about sacrifice. Most of us sacrifice every day, right? Work stress, bills, family drama. It's all the same. The quiet man's fingers tightened slightly around his cup. It was a small movement, almost unnoticeable. His face remained calm, but something deeper stirred behind his eyes. Not all sacrifices are equal, he said. Some come with choices. Others come with consequences you don't see until much later. That should have been the end of it. A respectful pause. A chance to move on. But the brother-in-law smiled again, a thin smile this time. Sounds heavy, he said. Guess some people like to feel important. No one laughed. The room felt smaller now, like the walls had moved closer. A few people glanced toward the door, as if wishing for fresh air. The quiet man set his cup down on a nearby table. His hands were steady. His voice, when he spoke again, was still controlled. Importance isn't something you claim, he said. It's something others decide, often long after you're gone. That sentence stayed in the air longer than the others. The brother-in-law scoffed and turned away, waving a hand as if dismissing the whole thing. He started talking to someone else, already losing interest. The quiet man stepped back toward the window. Outside, the street looked peaceful. Cars passed now and then. Children's voices echoed faintly from far away. Normal life. Inside, the gathering slowly returned to its usual rhythm. People talked again, though more softly. Plates were filled. Drinks were poured. The tension didn't disappear, but it settled. No one noticed when the quiet man checked his phone. The screen lit up briefly, showing a missed call. He didn't react. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and took a deep breath. He had been through louder rooms than this. Harsher words. Far heavier moments. Still, something about that careless disrespect lingered. Not because he needed praise, not because he wanted recognition, but because he had seen up close what those words ignored. He looked around the room once more. Family laughing. Arguments fading. Life going on for now. Stayed quiet. But the day was far from over. The rest of the afternoon moved forward, but it didn't feel the same. Conversations restarted, yet something invisible hung in the air. People laughed, but the laughter sounded careful, like they were afraid of stepping on something fragile. The brother-in-law acted as if nothing had happened. He joked loudly, filled his plate twice, told a story about a disagreement at work where he had clearly been in the wrong, but told it as if he were the hero. A few people nodded along. Others listened only halfway. The quiet man stayed mostly to himself. He helped clear a few dishes, thanked the person cooking, and returned to his spot near the window. He watched shadows move across the floor as the sun slowly shifted outside. Time felt slower to him than it probably did to everyone else. A woman from the family sat beside him for a moment. She lowered her voice. "Don't mind him," she said gently, nodding toward the brother-in-law. "He talks without thinking." The quiet man smiled, a small and tired smile. "It's all right," he replied. "Words come and go." She studied his face, as if trying to read something deeper. Before she could ask anything else, someone called her name from the kitchen, and she stood up and walked away. The brother-in-law soon found a new topic. He started talking about strength, about what it really meant to be tough in life. He spoke about long hours, difficult bosses, how nobody ever helped him. "I had to fight for everything I have," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Nobody handed me anything." The quiet man listened. He had heard similar words many times in many places. He didn't doubt the brother-in-law had struggled in his own way. Everyone had their battles. But the way he spoke left no room for anyone else's pain. Someone mentioned discipline. Another person mentioned respect. That's when the brother-in-law laughed again. "Respect is earned," he said. "Not given just because someone wore a uniform years ago." Some people looked at the quiet man without meaning to. He felt it, that soft pull of attention. He didn't welcome it, but he didn't hide from it either. "Respect isn't a reward," he said calmly. "It's a choice." The brother-in-law looked directly at him now. "You really believe that?" he asked. "I do," the quiet man replied. "Well, the brother-in-law said. Leaning back in his chair, I believe people love stories. Makes them feel better about things they don't understand. The quiet man nodded slowly. Some stories aren't meant to make people feel better, he said. They're meant to remind people. Answers seemed to irritate the brother-in-law more than anger would have. He leaned forward. Remind them of what? He asked. The quiet man paused. His gaze drifted to the floor for a second, then back up. Of cost, he said. Of what it takes to keep normal days normal, the brother-in-law scoffed. Sounds dramatic, he said. You talk like you've seen something special. The quiet man didn't answer right away. His eyes shifted to his hands. On his wrist, just visible beneath his sleeve, was a faded mark. It looked like an old burn or a scar. He gently pulled his sleeve down further, covering it. I've seen enough, he said. That should have ended it. Instead, the brother-in-law laughed louder. Enough of what? He said, people act like the world is always on the edge. It's not. Look around. We're fine. The quiet man looked around, just like the brother-in-law suggested. He saw people eating, smiling, scrolling on phones, living small, peaceful moments. Yes, he said softly. Right now, it is. That answer confused a few people. What do you mean? Someone asked. The quiet man didn't respond. He didn't want to explain. Some things couldn't be explained without opening doors better left closed. The brother-in-law shook his head and stood up, lifting his glass. To peace, he said with a grin. And two, not taking things too seriously. A few people raised their glasses halfway. Others didn't move. The quiet man remained seated, the brother-in-law noticed. Not joining. He asked. The quiet man looked up at him. I value peace too much to make jokes about it, he said. That landed harder than anyone expected. The room went silent again, this time heavier than before. The brother-in-law's smile dropped. You think you're better than us? He asked, his tone sharp now. No, the quiet man replied immediately. I think we're all responsible for what we say. The brother-in-law stared at him, jaw tight. You're taking this too far, he said. Maybe, the quiet man said. Or maybe it hasn't been taken far enough. That was when an older relative stood up, clearly uncomfortable. Let's eat, they said, quickly. Food's getting cold.
Ow.
The tension broke just enough for people to move again. Chairs scraped. Plates clinked. The moment passed, but it didn't disappear. Later, as people sat eating, the quiet man felt his phone vibrate again. He didn't take it out right away. He finished chewing, wiped his hands, then checked the screen under the table. Another missed call. Same number, his expression didn't change, but something in his shoulders shifted, as if he had prepared himself without anyone noticing. He typed a short message and sent it. Then he put the phone away. The brother-in-law noticed the movement. Busy man, he said sarcastically. Got important calls? The quiet man looked at him. Some responsibilities don't end, he said. The brother-in-law laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. Sure, he said. Guess some people like to feel needed. The quiet man didn't reply. As the meal continued, small details started to stand out. A low hum outside that wasn't there before. The faint sound of engines far down the street. Nobody paid attention. It blended into the normal noise of the neighborhood. The quiet man did notice. He glanced toward the window again, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in fear, but in awareness. Someone asked him where he lived now, not far. He said, What do you do these days? Another asked. I help where I can, he replied. The answers were simple, almost vague. He offered nothing extra. The brother-in-law rolled his eyes. Always mysterious, he said. People who talk like that usually don't have much to show. The quiet man finally looked directly at him. Really looked at him. Showing isn't the same as proving. He said. The brother-in-law opened his mouth to reply, then closed it. For the first time all day, he seemed unsure. Outside, the sound of engines grew slightly louder. Still distant. Still easy to ignore inside. The quiet man folded his napkin and set it aside. He stood up slowly. Thank you for the meal, he said politely to the room. You leaving already? Someone asked. "Not yet," he said. Just stepping outside for some air, he walked toward the door, calm and steady. As he opened it, the cool air brushed his face. Down the street, just barely visible between parked cars, dark shapes moved closer. The quiet man paused for half a second. Then he stepped outside. Behind him, the brother-in-law watched with narrowed eyes. Unaware that his careless words had already set something much bigger in motion, the quiet man stepped outside. Feeling the wind brush against his face, it was cooler than inside, and it carried the faint scent of the street. The distant hum of traffic and the ordinary sounds of life going on. Everything seemed calm, yet he could feel a subtle shift in the air. Sometimes silence speaks louder than voices. He glanced down the street, and that's when he saw them. At first, they were just dark shapes, moving slowly. But as they came closer, he could see the gleam of black SUVs. He didn't flinch. He had encountered situations before that required calm. Panic never helped. Back inside, the brother-in-law continued to talk loudly, trying to fill the silence with words. His voice carried, but it seemed to struggle against the tension he didn't understand. "You really think you're something special?" he said, pointing vaguely toward where the quiet man had just stepped outside. A few family members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The laughter had stopped. The clatter of forks and plates faded. Even the children seemed to sense something different. The quiet man's eyes remained on the approaching vehicles. He had seen black SUVs before, during assignments he had taken on many years ago. They moved with purpose. Their presence was intentional, not casual. Anyone familiar with protocol could see it immediately. Inside, someone mentioned that it must be a coincidence, maybe just visitors or neighbors. But the brother-in-law didn't see the same calm. He squinted through the window, trying to make sense of the shapes, the movement, the feeling of inevitability that had just entered their lives. The quiet man adjusted his jacket, making sure everything looked casual, but he moved deliberately toward the gate. Every step was measured, precise, controlled. There was no hurry, only awareness. His eyes scanned every angle, every movement. Even in a casual neighborhood afternoon, he was alert. The first SUV stopped a few feet from the curb. Its windows were dark, reflective, shielding the occupants. Then another stopped just behind it, and another. 3 black SUVs now, all precise, all silent in their approach, as if they had been waiting for the exact moment. The quiet man didn't panic. He knew this day would require presence of mind. The brother-in-law finally came to the door, curiosity and unease mixing in his expression. He had no idea what he was about to witness. He had only ever seen life as his own struggles, his own triumphs, his own loudness. "Who are they?" he asked nervously. The quiet man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer to the vehicles, and the doors opened in unison. Men in formal dark attire stepped out, not with aggression, but with precision. Every movement was disciplined, controlled, calculated. The brother-in-law felt a chill. His casual bravado had nothing to meet this. One of the men nodded slightly toward the quiet man. It was a small, subtle gesture, but it carried authority. The quiet man acknowledged it with a calm, almost invisible nod. Then he turned slowly to face his family. "I think it's time you all know," he said quietly, but with enough strength that everyone could hear. "I didn't come here to boast, and I don't need anyone's approval. But words have consequences." The brother-in-law opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His face turned pale. The laughter he had tried to maintain was gone. There was no joke left that could fill the space. Now one of the men in black stepped forward and handed something to the quiet man, a small envelope. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked at the brother-in-law, eyes steady, calm, almost serene. It was a look that spoke of experience, of stories untold, of courage that didn't need loud voices. The envelope contained a simple note, one that only a few in the family could understand. It confirmed what they had begun to suspect. The quiet man was no ordinary relative. He had served his country in ways most people couldn't imagine. The details were classified. The recognition he received in public life was limited. He had chosen to live quietly, away from fame and attention. Among family who barely knew the depth of his life, the brother-in-law finally stammered, trying to form a sentence. I didn't." The quiet man held up a hand, stopping him. "You already did," he said softly. The family remained frozen. No one moved. The quiet man's presence, combined with the SUVs and disciplined men outside, created a moment heavy with truth and realization. "You insulted someone you didn't know," the quiet man continued. "Someone who has seen things you couldn't imagine. Someone whose words are measured, whose silence carries weight. And now you see why respect matters." The brother-in-law's voice faltered. I didn't mean." "You did," the quiet man replied. "And now you understand that actions and words have impact beyond the room, beyond appearances." A gentle wind passed through the yard, as if emphasizing the truth of his words. The family finally began to breathe, some with relief, some with awe. The quiet man didn't need to shout or fight. His presence alone commanded attention, the kind that words could not match. The brother-in-law looked down, shame creeping into his posture. For the first time, he realized that arrogance and loudness could never replace integrity and courage. The man he had insulted had faced real danger, real responsibility, real fear. And he had remained calm, even in moments meant to provoke. The quiet man turned back toward the SUVs. "I have obligations," he said. "I live with them every day, quietly." Today was a reminder that words matter. And sometimes, silence matters more.
Oh.
The men in black nodded. The quiet man stepped into the first SUV. The vehicles started in unison. The engine sounds deep, but controlled. They didn't speed, but their presence alone carried authority. They left as silently and purposefully as they had arrived. Inside, the family slowly regained their voices. They looked at the brother-in-law, who sat frozen, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The quiet man had left, but the lesson remained. Heavier than any conversation they had shared that day, the children asked questions. The adults whispered, and slowly the ordinary noise of the house returned. But no one laughed like before. Even the air felt different. Charged with awareness, the brother-in-law stayed quiet, staring at the spot where the quiet man had stood. His pride was gone, replaced with something unfamiliar: humility. He realized, in a moment of unspoken clarity, that life had layers he hadn't considered, battles he hadn't faced, sacrifices he couldn't comprehend. The family didn't lecture him. They didn't make jokes. They simply let him sit with the truth. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. The quiet man was gone, yet his presence lingered. The lesson of the day had been delivered not with anger but with dignity, calm, and a quiet force that spoke louder than any words the brother-in-law had ever used. And in that silence, everyone understood: true courage doesn't need attention, and respect is earned, often in ways unseen. The quiet man had reminded them, in the simplest but most powerful way, that some lines should never be crossed, and some stories carry weight long before they are told. The quiet man had stepped back inside briefly to collect a small bag he had brought. Nothing extravagant, just essentials. The family watched him move with calm purpose. Every step he took seemed intentional, measured. There was no rush, yet an invisible urgency hung in the air, unspoken but understood. The black SUVs were still parked outside, engines off, waiting, almost silent in their presence. Their dark forms seemed to cast a shadow over the yard, making the ordinary afternoon feel different, heavier, significant. The brother-in-law hovered near the doorway, torn between curiosity, fear, and disbelief. He had spent the past few hours mocking, talking, and trying to assert himself, and now every ounce of his confidence felt like it was slipping away. He watched the quiet man bend slightly to pick up the bag and straighten again. The kind of posture someone assumes only when they are used to moving with both authority and discretion. A woman from the family, sensing the tension, took a step toward the brother-in-law. Maybe you should say something," she suggested quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The brother-in-law shook his head. He didn't know what to say. Every word he could think of sounded empty, shallow, and meaningless in that moment. The quiet man turned briefly toward everyone in the living room. "I'm not here to make enemies," he said softly. "I came here to visit family and to remind someone that respect is not something you demand. It is something you understand only when it is due." He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the men outside who opened the doors of the SUVs in unison. Their movement was precise, practiced, and calm. It reminded the family that these were not ordinary men. They were disciplined, and they followed instructions without hesitation. Their presence amplified the seriousness of the moment, though no one needed them to raise their voices to make it clear. The brother-in-law swallowed hard. He wanted to make a joke, to break the tension somehow, but no words came out. His usual bravado had completely abandoned him. The quiet man noticed, but didn't speak directly to him yet. Instead, he turned toward the SUVs and stepped into the first vehicle with measured calm. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. He did not look back. The other men followed his example. Their movements were synchronized, deliberate. The brother-in-law's gaze tracked each one, his pulse quickening, realizing with a mix of fear and awe that these men were here not for show, but for protection, for action if it was ever required. And their presence made the quiet man's past his achievements, and his authority undeniable. The family remained frozen, absorbing the reality of what they had just witnessed. Words felt inadequate. The quiet man had lived a life that few could comprehend. And in one afternoon, he had shown them only the smallest glimpse of it. Yet it was enough to make an impact, enough to command a respect that the brother-in-law could know. Longer ignored, the brother-in-law finally found a whisper of a voice. You can't just—" he started, but the words fell flat. He trailed off, realizing that nothing he said would undo what had already been revealed. His insults, his mockery, his laughter, none of it mattered anymore. The truth of the quiet man's life overshadowed everything. An older relative, trying to fill the silence, cleared their throat and said, "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." But even their voice, usually soothing, felt small against the weight of the moment. The quiet man, now seated calmly in the first SUV, looked toward the house once more. His eyes briefly met the brother-in-law's. It was not anger, nor was it judgment. It was quiet, firm authority. A message conveyed in silence. Understanding and respect cannot be demanded. They are recognized in moments like these. By those who choose to see beyond appearances. The engines of the SUVs started with a low hum. The vehicles moved in formation down the street, leaving the house quieter than it had ever been that afternoon. The brother-in-law slumped against the doorway, finally realizing that his words had consequences far beyond what he could have imagined. He had crossed a line, and the line had been marked by experience, courage, and discipline he had neither known nor understood. The family slowly began to breathe again. They exchanged looks that said more than words ever could. There was pride for the quiet man, yes, but also relief that the situation had remained under control. And there was a shared understanding. Some people live lives in the shadows of history, carrying burdens and performing duties that others cannot imagine, and their humility does not make them small, it makes them. Remarkable, the brother-in-law remained quiet for the rest of the afternoon. He stayed in his chair, staring at the place where the SUVs had been parked, playing every word he had spoken, every laugh he had forced. It was not fear, exactly. It was realization. The quiet man had shown him something that could not be unlearned, that real heroism exists without fanfare, that courage is quiet, and that respect is earned in ways far beyond what he had ever experienced. As an evening approached, the family resumed their activities slowly. Conversations were tentative at first, then gradually picked up, but they had changed. They spoke with an awareness that hadn't been there before. The quiet man's lesson lingered, subtle but powerful. Even the children, playing in the corner, seemed to carry a sense that something important had occurred. The brother-in-law didn't speak to anyone for the rest of the day. He stayed in one spot, reflecting, listening, absorbing the lessons silently. Words would not come easily. Pride had been replaced with humility and arrogance with understanding. For him, the day had been transformative in ways he did not yet fully comprehend. Outside, the street returned to its ordinary rhythm, cars passing by, neighbors talking, children's laughter echoing in the distance. But inside that house, and in the hearts of those present, nothing would ever be quite the same. The quiet man had left, but the echo of his presence, his calm authority, and the reminder of true courage lingered. That evening, as the sun set, the family gathered together quietly. They shared memories, small jokes, and gentle laughter, but beneath it all was a shared understanding. Some people are heroes in ways that cannot be measured, and those who insult them without knowing do so at their own peril. The lesson had been delivered not with anger or spectacle, but with dignity, calm, and undeniable truth. The brother-in-law finally stood, facing the family. His voice was low, careful, and sincere. I didn't understand," he said. I was wrong." I spoke without thinking. I should have listened." The family nodded, understanding that this was the first step toward acknowledgement, toward learning humility and respect. And though the quiet man had gone, the mark he left would remain, guiding not only the brother-in-law, but everyone present. A lesson in courage, in quiet strength. And in the unspoken weight of true experience, the quiet man was gone. The SUVs had left, and the street outside had returned to its usual rhythm. The family sat in a quiet room, a kind of stillness that followed the storm of words, revelations, and realizations. It wasn't a heavy silence, but a thoughtful one. People were reflecting, in their own ways, on what had happened. The brother-in-law remained in his chair, staring at the empty doorway, replaying every word, every gesture, every moment from earlier. His mind kept circling back to the calm authority, the silent power, and the undeniable truth that he had witnessed. Pride and bravado, which had always been his shields, felt useless now. They were not only inadequate, but almost foolish in the face of real courage and dignity. He shifted slightly, noticing how different the room felt. The warmth of the late afternoon sun, the faint scent of food, the gentle hum of conversation, it all seemed almost surreal. Nothing looked changed, and yet everything felt altered. Something important had happened, something that would remain with him forever. A family member approached him carefully, trying to bridge the silence. "It's a lot to take in," they said gently. He nodded slowly. I didn't understand. I spoke without knowing. I mocked without realizing what I was mocking." The words were whispered, almost as if speaking them aloud could somehow undo the lesson. But in saying them, he acknowledged it. He was finally seeing beyond the shallow surface of life he had always relied on. The older relative who had tried to calm the tension earlier spoke up. "It's not easy to admit when we're wrong," they said softly. "But the quiet man showed us something important today. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to fight. He just reminded us what matters." The brother-in-law absorbed that, letting it sink in. The lesson wasn't about fear or power. It was about understanding, respect, and humility. The quiet man had lived a life far beyond anything the brother-in-law had imagined. He had seen things, experienced moments, and carried burdens that the others couldn't even begin to comprehend. Across the room, family members exchanged glances. They were relieved the day hadn't escalated into something worse, but they also felt gratitude. Gratitude for witnessing a rare moment of authentic strength, for seeing the difference between bravado and courage, for understanding that real heroes often live quietly among us. The brother-in-law finally looked up. His voice was low, careful, sincere. "I need to apologize," he said. "Not just for what I said, but for how I acted. I wasn't thinking. I didn't respect what I should have." The family nodded, not with judgment, but with recognition that acknowledgement was the first step. He was starting to see, in fragments, the depth of his mistake. And with that realization, he began to understand the importance of restraint, of humility, and of listening before speaking. Later, as the evening grew darker, the family gathered in smaller groups, sharing quiet conversations. Stories of past experiences, small achievements, and lessons learned were exchanged. The atmosphere was calm, reflective, and thoughtful. The quiet man's presence had left a mark even in his absence, and it shaped the way the family now viewed each other and themselves. Children played quietly in a corner, occasionally glancing at the adults, sensing the weight of the day's events without fully understanding it. Their laughter was gentle, a reminder that life continues, even after powerful lessons are delivered. And in their innocence, the family could see the reminder of what mattered most: respect, kindness, and understanding. The brother-in-law sat alone for a while, thinking. He reflected not only on the quiet man's words, but on his own behavior. He realized that true strength wasn't about making others look small, or about speaking over them, or about showing off. True strength was quiet, measured, and often unseen. It was in how one treated others, in how one acted when no one was watching, and in the humility to admit when one was wrong. He replayed the day's events over and over in his mind. The quiet man had shown that real courage isn't loud, real respect isn't demanded, and real character isn't measured by how many people applaud you, but by how you act when no one is looking. He felt a mix of shame and gratitude. Shame for his own arrogance and lack of understanding, gratitude for the chance to learn, to witness a life so profoundly different from his own, and to be reminded that life has layers that he hadn't even begun to comprehend. The family began to clean up, putting away dishes and folding napkins. Conversations were light again, but under the surface, everyone carried the quiet lesson of the day. The brother-in-law, for the first time, listened more than he spoke. He asked questions, not to prove himself, but to understand. He nodded at others' stories, gave genuine smiles, and realized that humility felt heavier, but in a good way. It felt right. By the time night fully descended, the house was quieter, yet warm. The earlier tension had settled into something stronger, more permanent: respect, reflection, and understanding. The brother-in-law had started a journey from arrogance to awareness. A journey that would continue long after the quiet man had left. The last rays of the sun faded, leaving behind the soft glow of lamps and the calm hum of life. The quiet man's presence had passed, but his lesson remained. It lingered in the hearts of the family, in the changed attitude of the brother-in-law, and in the small, gentle shifts in the household that would continue to ripple outward. The brother-in-law finally spoke again, quietly but firmly. "I don't want to be that person again," he said to himself. "I want to understand before I speak. I want to respect before I judge." And in that simple acknowledgement, the transformation began. Words had consequences. Actions had weight. Respect and humility were earned, often quietly, sometimes without recognition, but always with impact. The family settled for the night, carrying a new understanding with them. The brother-in-law felt the shift within himself. He had crossed a line, yes, but he had also learned what it meant to truly see another person, to understand their experiences, and to acknowledge their courage without needing to overshadow it. Outside, the night was calm. The world went on, cars passed, distant voices echoed, and children dreamed in their beds. Yet inside that house, a quiet revolution had occurred, a change in hearts that no one could undo. The quiet man had come, delivered his lesson, and left. And the brother-in-law, for the first time, truly understood the weight and value of respect, humility, and real courage. The next morning dawned quietly, with soft sunlight filtering through the curtains. The family awoke with a lingering sense of reflection from the day before. Breakfast was prepared and served, but the atmosphere had changed. The laughter was calmer, the conversations more measured. Everyone seemed to carry a subtle awareness, a reminder that the quiet man's visit had left an indelible mark. The brother-in-law moved slowly, still processing what had happened. The weight of realization pressed upon him, and he felt the sting of embarrassment mixed with gratitude. He knew he had learned something profound, an experience that would not fade with time. He watched as others went about their morning routines. Some were chatting quietly over coffee, others preparing to leave for work or errands. There was a normal rhythm to life, yet beneath it all was the resonance of the lesson delivered. so elegantly the day before, he couldn't stop thinking about the quiet man. His calm, measured presence, the way he carried himself without arrogance, without loud words, how he had corrected without raising his voice, how he had made a point that would linger far longer than any shouting or argument ever could. At some point, the brother-in-law sat at the table, his coffee cooling beside him. He stared into the cup, thinking about his actions, his words, his pride. He realized how often he had spoken without considering the consequences, how often he had dismissed others' experiences, thinking only of his own perspective, and he felt a genuine need to change. The family began to gather in the living room, discussing plans for the day. Yet there were glances exchanged, quiet acknowledgments, a shared sense of understanding that something important had shifted. The brother-in-law listened more than he spoke, nodding as others shared stories and small updates. For the first time, he felt the difference in truly listening, not just hearing. A cousin, noticing the change, leaned in and whispered, "I think he really understood yesterday." The brother-in-law gave a small, reflective nod. He didn't need to respond. The change was already happening inside him. He was beginning to see life from a perspective beyond his own, beyond ego and pride. Later, as the morning progressed, the brother-in-law stepped outside for a moment. The street was quiet, the sunlight warm on his face. He took a deep breath, thinking about the quiet man's words. That respect is earned, that courage is quiet, that actions matter more than loud declarations. He realized that these were not abstract ideas, but practical truths for how he should live. He walked slowly down the yard, noticing small details he hadn't before, the way the flowers leaned toward the sun, the distant hum of a car, the soft chirping of birds. Life, he realized, carried its own rhythm, and it deserved careful attention. The family continued their day, running errands, talking, and going about their routines. Yet the brother-in-law found himself pausing more often, considering his words, considering how his actions might affect others. He found himself apologizing sincerely for small missteps, noticing that the act of acknowledging fault brought a quiet satisfaction and relief by afternoon. He had spent time reflecting on how easily arrogance can blind a person. He thought about all the times he had dismissed someone's experience or mocked their achievements. He realized that humility wasn't a weakness, it was a strength, a quiet power that could transform relationships and perspectives. The house, though filled with normal life, had a new energy. The family moved with ease, but the subtle lessons of respect, awareness, and observation permeated their actions. Conversations were warmer, more genuine, and carried a sense of mindfulness. The brother-in-law found himself alone for a few minutes, sitting near the window. He watched the world outside, children playing in the distance, neighbors going about their day, cars passing by. He thought about the quiet man, about the discipline, the courage, and the integrity he had displayed. He realized that these qualities could guide his own life. If he chose to embrace them, he made a promise to himself, quietly and sincerely, to listen more, to speak less without thought, to respect those who had experiences he could not imagine. He understood that true courage didn't need applause. True respect was earned silently, often without recognition. As evening approached, the family began to gather again. Stories were shared, jokes were told, and laughter returned, though gentler, more aware. The brother-in-law participated fully, but his voice carried a different tone, less need to dominate, more desire to connect, to understand. At dinner, he found an opportunity to speak, addressing his family with sincerity. "I want to thank everyone for their patience yesterday," he said quietly, "and I want to apologize for my words. I didn't understand, but I want to learn and do better." The family responded with smiles and nods. They didn't need grand gestures. The simple acknowledgement, combined with his changed behavior, was enough. Respect, they knew, was sometimes demonstrated in quiet actions more than words. Later, as the night fell, the brother-in-law reflected on the day's lessons. He thought about how easily one can misjudge others, how shallow understanding can lead to mistakes, and how a single encounter can transform one's perspective. The quiet man had left, yet his influence remained subtle, powerful, and enduring. he realized that the journey was just beginning. Awareness, humility, and respect were not one-time achievements, but lifelong practices, and he felt ready for the first time to embrace them sincerely, without pretense or ego. The family eventually settled for the night. Quiet filled the house, gentle and reflective. Each member carried with them a sense of growth, awareness, and understanding. And the brother-in-law, finally at peace with himself, knew that he had taken the first real steps toward becoming a better person, someone who could recognize true courage, understand real sacrifice, and act with respect in all his words and actions. Outside, the night was calm, stars twinkling in the clear sky. Life continued, ordinary and unremarkable to the casual observer, yet extraordinary in the quiet transformations happening within a single household. And somewhere in the distance, perhaps already gone, the quiet man had completed his visit, leaving behind lessons that would ripple quietly, steadily, and meaningfully through the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed him.